Hi, Ashley. We're going to take a look at your aesthetics and control posting here. Just kind of get a quick overview first. Take a look at what we have. This one's clearly dark. Looks like we have your shutter speeds going on here. You've got some various lighting settings here. At least you're identifying those. I can see that the color sort of shifts are going on, but you're identifying them, which tells me that you're understanding that you're doing these things. So that's good that you're identifying those things. Here we have the how deep. We'll talk about that for once we get to there. The equivalent exposures. That equivalent exposures is basically sort of like a little math problem there. And you have your, you know better. So actually, it looks like you have to hold or not to hold toward the end there. And then looks like you put your you know better first. So you have the you know better first, but I'm going to start off down here with the hold or not to hold, just because that is the sort of the first one that we were looking at. Now, your exposures look fine on these. They look just fine as far as the brightness and the darkness of them. Not everybody did that. There were quite a few students who had some issues with that, but yours seemed to be okay. Also, you are taking good advantage of where things are being moving. With half a second, we know that you can't hold the camera steady at a half a second. But on something like this, you're taking advantage of the shadows. We've got movement. You're sort of moving the camera almost deliberately there a little bit to give yourself a little bit of that kind of energy, but you're utilizing the shadow areas and shape to your advantage, a little bit of the texture to your advantage on that. Where it really gets to be a little bit more awkward has to do with a 15th of a second, which I think is part of what everybody identifies. A half a second, you get this kind of cool movement. A 25th of a second, 1/25th of a second, you get, you know, a pretty clear image, that kind of thing. But when you get into a 15th of a second, that's when it's like this awkward middle ground where you can't quite hold the camera steady, but it's not quite slow enough to get cool movement either. You really kind of identify it at that point where you want to avoid using almost a 15th unless you have a tripod to keep the whole thing steady. So the shutter speed is really just about introducing you to the idea of deliberate camera movement. What happens when you're using that? What do different shutter speeds do? Where's the control? All of that kind of stuff. You've got your exposures working fairly well. Now, you kind of jump over here to the equivalent exposure. We'll take a look at that. That's just basically a math problem that we have to work out. And we started off with asking you to set it up at f8, a 60th of a second at ISO 200. So here's your f8, 60th of a second, ISO 200. And then we are asked to move the aperture in one direction by 2 spots or 3 spots, and then compensate in the other direction by the equivalent exposure to get the exposure to be equal. Now you can see your exposures are varying a little bit here, which tells me that you didn't quite get it exactly right. Here we have f8, a 60th of a second at 200. Then we went to a 5/6 at 1/25th at 200, and that is correct. Okay, you only went one step though, right? You went 5/6, which is more open, and then we did 1/25th, which is a shorter amount of time by one step, right? The mistake you made there isn't that you didn't correct it properly. You did correct it properly by doing the one step. The mistake you made is you did 3 clicks, not 3 steps. Remember, steps are whole f-stops. So 1, 2, 3 is to get to one step. The clicks are intermediate steps on your camera. That's important to understand. So you did it right, but you didn't go far enough. I guess that's what it is. So then the next step, there's evidence of you not quite getting it right. So the reason I know that the reason that we do those clicks is here. Now you can see the image is bright. Why is it bright? The reason it's bright is because you're misunderstanding clicks for steps. Here you got it correct because you went 1, 2, 3 clicks, but you compensated correctly on the other side. Here, what we have is you went from 200 to 800. That is doubling and doubling again as far as sensitivity. But you went to 1, 2, 3 clicks and only compensated by a 2/3 of a step. So that is why the image got brighter. It's because you made the image much more sensitive, but you did not reduce the exposure by enough to compensate. So that's why the image is still very bright. Why it looks different. So that's okay. In terms of what you've presented here, what you've presented here is evidence that when the exposure isn't compensated properly, what's the consequence? It gets brighter. So you can deliberately make an image slightly brighter by doing what you've done by accident. So that's what happened here. It looks like you did the same thing on the second one, and it looks like you did the same thing on the third one. So you are consistently doing the same thing, slightly wrong on all three, which tells me that you kind of understood what you were doing, but you had the clicks instead of whole steps. So there you go. You got that kind of right, but you got it almost right. All right, so let's take a look at your how deep, and that's the apertures, right? So aperture has all to do with, in this case, depth of field. So the apertures are just numbers, just like all the other stuff, they're just numbers until you connect them to an image. And in the image, apertures are a reflection of what we call the depth of field, which we've explained has to do with what's in focus really far forward, like my hand, and what's in focus really far away, like the door jamb back there, and in the middle, which would be me. If my hand is in focus, if I'm in focus, if the door jamb's in focus, that's considered deep depth of field. However, if my hand is not in focus, I'm in focus and the door is not, that would be considered shallow depth of field. Depending on what I'm trying to achieve, I could want one or the other. Now, with these kind of webcams, you get a very small aperture because it assumes that you want lots in focus. But with our cameras, we can adjust it and create shallow depths of field and so on. So that's what we're exploring here. The whole experiment is just to show you that and for you to control that within your camera and to introduce to you where that control is on your camera. Where again, we're seeing a little bit of confusion is you're confusing clicks with steps because we have here F5, F18, F25. Those aren't Fs, those are clicks in between F stops. Our F stops are only 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22. The steps in between those are just fractions. Sure, they're numbers. They actually are f-stop equivalents, but we don't use them. The reason we don't use them is because that's too many numbers to try to memorize. Plus, it's only a half a measure or a third of a measure in between. So we use 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We use them as steps to get to whole steps. So when we say do a whole step between one aperture and another, that is, in terms of our cameras, that's 1, 2, 3 for a whole step, because the clicks measure a third of a step. So we have f5.6, we have 2 clicks before we get to 8. So you have 5, 6, click, click, and 8. So in between 5, 6, and 8 are 2 little stops, 2 little clicks. Those 2 little clicks are what you have over here, which are those in between numbers. We don't use those in between numbers. That's what you have here. That said, you still presented the depth of field. We can still see the consequence of depth of field here in your images. So you're still doing the same thing. You're still confusing the clicks with the whole steps. Not a big deal. But I want to highlight it so that you understand that that's what you're doing, so that you can know that when we're talking about, okay, we want you to go a whole step, Ashley, you'll know what we're talking about. It's not just a click, it's 1, 2, 3 clicks. It's a whole f-stop or a whole shutter speed, what that represents when you're using your camera in manual mode. All right, so now we're over into your you know better, where you can just sort of play. And I like what you're doing with the various white balances. You're identifying that you're paying attention. This one just gets a little dark. I think you know that's not a big deal. We'll just skip over it. Here we again got a little bit dark. We're a little bit close on the edge here. If this was cropped off here, I think it'd be a better image. I like what you're doing with just sort of not being afraid to put something very dark right up there in the front. Using the movement, you're really being playful here. This one is probably less effective than this in terms of incorporating movement. They're also very similar. This one just takes advantage of the movement and you're up closer and that kind of stuff. I could have probably done without this one. It doesn't really contribute to your series as much. Same thing with this one. I mean, if we were doing just a series and you were kind of picture storying, doing a picture story where this image, this particular setup was shot over and over and over again for a very specific reason, it was changing subtly or something like that, that makes sense. But these are way too similar to have in the same series unless there's some conceptual reason to have them doing this, right? So I would say explore more, have a little bit more fun with playing around with different, with different settings. Sometimes we put rules on ourselves for no apparent reason, right? We sometimes limit ourselves. We think, well, there must be some rules. And it can kind of confuse us when there are no rules, like, wait, just play? But sometimes we have to do that. And you know better is just that. We wanted you to really just play. So you have a couple of things that we misstepped on, but I think overall you have the concepts right. We clarified, hopefully you now understand the difference between the clicks on your camera and what a whole measure is, a whole f-stop is. Sorry, I keep bumping the camera there. What a whole measure is and that type of thing. Hopefully you'll understand that. We'll talk a little bit later. We're going to have meetings with everybody after Thanksgiving break to decide, what you might want to redo if there's a need to. I don't necessarily think you'll have to, but we'll revisit that when we do. So look forward to more of your photography and we'll see you in the studio. Bye-bye now.